All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. My name's Becca Price, and I'm the communications coordinator for RMS. And you are in a river management roundtable where we're going to explore all of the different perspectives on fish barriers and native fish. We've got an awesome panel lined up, so we really appreciate you joining us. If you are not familiar with RMS or you're not a member, we are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to support professionals who study, protect, and manage rivers. And one of the ways we do that is by hosting once a month river management roundtables, where we discuss a topic that has been suggested by our members and hopefully leave you with some tidbits of knowledge. So thanks for coming, and we hope you'll join us in future months as well. A little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today. We invite you to be on camera. We'd love to see your face. That's a lot more fun for everyone, but please remain muted unless you are speaking. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. We're going to have a little bit of presentation in the beginning, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. But you can drop questions in at any time, and at the end, we'll invite you to come off mute. And then also, we just want to remind you, there are a lot of different perspectives on this topic, so just, try to be open-minded, respect other people's perspectives, and make sure you give other people time to ask questions and comment as well.
So I'll take over for a little bit here. Welcome again. My name is Risa Shimoda. I'm the Executive Director of River Management Society, and I'm thrilled to see lots of people here. Great to see lots of familiar faces. And we have a cast of thousands here to talk about this important topic. Kestrel coons from American Whitewater. I'm going to have folks just come on and tell you a little bit about themselves and their perspective as we go through the programs that are right now. Brian Hodge is here from Trout Unlimited. Brian, maybe wave a little bit. Sam Swanson from McLaughlin Whitewater, Steve Chesterton from the Forest Service, and me. So I'm going to kick us off by sort of just framing maybe like at 10,000 feet or 5,000 feet, the topic and the issue, I guess. So let's start with the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And it's longer than this, but the primary components are that it told us the federal agencies were supposed to provide a means and a program to conserve the ecosystems for endangered species and threatened species, both, and do whatever we need to do, appropriate steps to address relevant international treaties and conventions, of which there are many, relative to different kinds of species with different continents, with different countries, and so forth. So that's just a quick synopsis. And then going back a few years, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968 there's two main components that you might have heard, and one little one that I'm slipping in also. The purpose is to protect and enhance specific rivers' free-flowing conditions, the water quality, and outstandingly remarkable values, which could be has to be at least one of these, and can be some others that are not listed here, but those are kind of the basic ones. And then, this was all put into effect in response to there being a tremendous kind of surge of damming around in this country. So to complement the national policy of dams and other construction with this act, and then to preserve the rivers in their free-flowing condition, so that we're protecting the water quality and we're fulfilling whatever important conservation purposes are relevant to those rivers. So given that, we're going to come back in greater depth. Kestrel's going to talk about this, but Fossil Creek, just as an example, kind of very interesting and kind of special example, this is home to a bunch of important native species that are listed there. I'm not going to say them because I might mispronounce them. And to the right, you see Fossil Creek, and a specific part of that was constructed to protect these native species. And just go back to that one quote from from a Bureau of Reclamation fellow. So this project was designed and is perceived to have accomplished the return of this river to its purely native and natural state. So we're trying to protect native species, and we're trying to also keep rivers free flowing, those that are designated wild and scenic. And on Fossil Creek, at first blush, it might look like we're not exactly doing both. So who decides whether the survival of a native species is more important than the free flowing character? These are some fish down on the Gila. So this is what we're here for today. And I think we'll find that the question isn't that simple. It's not that black and white. So the perspectives here will help us understand how complicated this topic is. And we're gonna now have the experts in the room share with you. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brisa. So my name is Brian Hodge. I'm a fisheries scientist with Trout Unlimited. And my hope for this afternoon is to offer a little bit insight into today's topic of fish barriers from the perspective or through the lens of conservation biology. And I'll be operating off the assumption that native species and free-flowing rivers need not be mutually exclusive, but can actually be compatible or complementary pursuits. And so I thought we might start with the topic of fish barriers with a quick definition. And I know Risa introduced that, but maybe just in the interest of making that clear before we advance here. Generally speaking, a fish barrier could be any obstacle that stops the movement of fishes. And I think within the context of today's conversation, we could probably narrow that definition and say that a fish barrier is any man-made or natural but man-altered structure that's been designed and constructed for the specific intent of blocking invasions or blocking upstream movement of non-native fishes. And I think to make sense of that topic, we might actually start with just a little bit of context. Next slide, please. So science tells us that non-native fishes can affect native species and ecosystems in a number of ways. So to start, we know that non-native fishes can hybridize with, prey upon, compete with, and even introduce disease to native fishes, and that ultimately that can result in the decline, if not extirpation or extinction of native fishes. Second, we know that non-native fishes can trigger declines in the distribution and abundance of native amphibians. And then last, we know that non-native fishes can alter or restructure food webs. Sometimes those effects rippling out as far as bugs, spiders, birds, and bats in the adjacent forest ecosystems. Next slide, please. So for more than 50 years, fish barriers have been used to stop the invasions of non-native fishes and to reduce or eliminate the very risks that we just talked about. And as you can see from a sample of photos here, fish barriers can take on a number of different shapes and sizes. Depending upon stream size and power, the desired lifespan of the structure, accessibility to the site, etc. And regardless of what the exact composition and look of a barrier is, again, the intent is to try to prevent that invasion or upstream movement of non-native fishes. And typically that's done by trying to exploit the limitations of the swimming or jumping capabilities of fish. And so often fish barriers resemble log drop structures, cascades, or waterfalls, and they're often or typically specifically designed to be taller than a fish can jump. Next slide, please. So that was a really quick synopsis of the sort of the what, the why, and the how of fish barriers. And I thought now we might maybe shift gears for a minute and talk a little bit about the if, when, and where of fish barriers. And so a little more than a decade ago, Hawk and Williams introduced us to this idea of the conservation portfolio. And in short, it's this idea that we can increase the probability of species persistence by dispersing the risk of extirpation or extinction. And maybe in really simple terms, that's just another way of saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And so while we won't talk about much more conservation theory here today. I thought actually maybe a good instructive use of our time here would be to walk through a hypothetical but plausible example of a decision. And so hopefully you're all seeing two polygons on the right-hand side of the screen here, one of them being orange and one being green. And within each of those polygons, each of these red worms represents a native trout population. So for sake of argument, let's say that the one population that shows up in the red subbasin is not only the only representative from that watershed, but also a genetically pure and unique population, an aboriginal population. And let's say, for continuing with the sake of argument here, that the 10 or so populations in this green subbasin are copies of one another. So as I've laid this out here, and all else being equal, the population from the orange subbasin or watershed would float to the top as a conservation priority. And if we were to view that within the context of this conservation portfolio framework, then that population would float to the top as a resource or an asset warranting or requiring protection, if not also replication on the landscape. Next slide, please. So once a population has been identified as a conservation priority, then resource managers face a number of key and important decisions, and several of which pertain directly to today's conversation or topic. And among those is the question of what's the risk of an invasion by non-native fishes? For example, how far away are the nearest non-native fishes? How many of them are there? And how easy or difficult would it be for those non-native fishes to encroach into native fish occupied habitat? And so, as you can imagine, the answers to these types of questions are going to inform the need for a barrier or lack thereof. Next slide, please. So in the event a population is deemed at risk to an invasion by non-native fishes, then resource managers face yet another tough question or decision, namely, is that native fish population more or less likely to persist if it's isolated above a barrier? And this is a question and topic to which entire papers have been devoted. While isolation above a barrier reduces or completely eliminates that risk of invasion and displacement by non-native fishes, isolating fish above barriers has its own connotations or its own drawbacks and costs, if you will. And most of those, or many of those, owing to the fragmentation of habitat and long-term reductions in genetic diversity, life history diversity. And so to balance those trade-offs, managers are typically wanting to isolate the largest extent of habitat possible above the fish barrier. And so in the interest of time here, I might wrap up with one parting thought. And that's this idea that by the time a river or stream has been identified as a candidate for a fish barrier, three conditions have very likely or ideally been met. One, the population in question has been identified as a conservation priority, and thus one warranting protection, if not also replication. Two, an invasion by non-native fishes will have been identified as a real or imminent threat. And three, the benefits of isolating that native fish population will have been carefully considered against the cost of isolation and ultimately viewed as outweighing. In other words, the benefits will have been viewed as outweighing the costs. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, and thanks again for your time, and I'll turn it back over to you, Risa.
Okay, I think I'm
gonna go right to Kestrel. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Risa. Awesome. Thank you, Brian. That was really helpful. And hi, everybody. My name's Kestrel Coons. I work for American Whitewater. I'm based in Colorado, and I'm the Southern Rockies Protection Director. If you haven't heard, American Whitewater was founded in 1954 with a mission to protect and restore America's whitewater rivers and to enhance opportunities to enjoy them safely. And our original members played a key role in the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. And 55 years later, it is still our most important tool to protect free-flowing rivers. So river recreationists highly value the unimpeded rivers that are protected by the Act. And at the same time, we value the native fish and their habitat that often exists on these rivers. So inherently, free-flowing rivers attract both boaters and native fish. And while we learned from Brian, the concept of intentional fish barriers and the practice of them is not new, we have started to encounter more and more fish barrier projects on both eligible and designated wild and scenic rivers. And so kind of to address this complex dichotomy, American Whitewater is seeking to protect the integrity of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act while also supporting native fish protection efforts. So as part of this balance, we just have, at least three pillars that we're aiming to achieve. And the first one is that proposed fish barriers on wild and scenic rivers and those eligible should go through a robust review. Second, that natural barriers like waterfalls should be prioritized instead of construction or modification. And three, that rivers should not be permanently altered by the construction of fish barriers. And so while we stand by these three different standards, every river and project has its own complexities. So I'm hoping that the next following case studies here highlight some of these nuances. And next slide, please. Thanks. And so as Risa mentioned, the Wild and Scenic Fossil Creek in Arizona has a fish barrier on it to protect a number of native southwestern fishes. And you can see the barrier here on Fossil Creek in the left photo. And so this barrier, along with numerous others in the region, was mandated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a mitigation measure for the Central Arizona Project Canal, which essentially acts as a conduit for invasive fish from the Colorado River to the Gila River watershed in Arizona. However, I do think the timeline here is relevant for our discussion. And a part of that is that Fossil Creek actually already had a fish barrier on it before it was designated as a wild and scenic river in 2009. And so post-designation, it was determined that the barrier that was in place had been breached and needed to be rebuilt. So after that, a Section 7 analysis found that the proposed barrier would not impact the river's free flow and the ORVs. And since a barrier was already in place, this doesn't necessarily set a strong precedent for constructing entirely new barriers on already designated wild and scenic rivers. You can see the map on the left here depicts 8 different barriers in the region that were completed by 2018. And 4 more are in progress, including on the Upper Verde River, which is an eligible wild and scenic river. Next slide. So on the Verde River, there's 2 fish barriers that are being proposed under the same mandate from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the same mandate as Fossil Creek. But unlike Fossil Creek, the Upper Verde River does not have existing waterfall features, and the proposed barriers resemble something much closer to a standard low-head dam. The project website includes this diagram on the bottom left, and then an example of on the West Fork Black River of an existing fish barrier. And so due to these initial designs and the potential for the barriers to impede the free flow, the Forest Service initiated a suitability study on the Upper Verde River. And meanwhile, at the same time, there's also a substantial grassroots effort that is working on designating the Upper Verde as wild and scenic. And we're still awaiting the outcomes of this suitability study, and the results will give us some indication how this particular forest intends to balance native fish reintroduction and wild and scenic river protections. Next slide. And then one of my last examples here is on Colorado's only wild and scenic river, the Cache La Poudre, where there's a series of temporary and permanent fish barriers proposed as part of the Cache La Poudre Headwaters Restoration Project. And this was as the result of a legal settlement where the fish barriers were mandated as mitigation for the expansion of Long Draw Reservoir, which is in the headwaters of the Poudre watershed. So the farthest downstream barrier in the project is proposed to be the kind of one primary permanent barrier, and is also in wilderness in a wild and scenic river segment classified as wild, and on a particular whitewater rapid in the well-known Big South section of the river. And so that rapid at super low water is on the left here. And as a part of this project, our American Whitewater's involvement has been to try and find a balanced solution to the barriers. And that's included an initial proposal at an alternate location downstream on a larger existing waterfall feature where it's possible that modification might not be needed. So these are just, 3 different examples. There are a few more examples and a super high level overview, because each of these projects and places are very much more complex than one can describe in a couple minutes. But kind of to sum all of that up, as American Whitewater, as a river advocacy organization, we are continuing to run into this conflict or perceived conflict as we work both to protect wild and scenic rivers and support native fish restoration. And so we've seen in practice that river managers have had varied approaches to this issue, including one example on the Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico that actually made fish barriers a prerequisite for the fishery ORV. So one of our desired outcomes for this conversation and future ones is to achieve better clarity for both river managers and river advocates, and to explore maybe some new solutions outside the box. But I'll pass it to Steve to review what federal guidelines are in place.
Thanks, Kestrel. Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Chesterton, and I am the Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service, based out of the agency's Washington office in DC. I also serve as one of the Forest Service representatives on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council, which, if you're not familiar with that body, as the name suggests, it's an interagency council focused on coordinating across the National Wild and Scenic River system, consistent understanding of the requirements of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and managing as one system across the 4 primary federal Wild and Scenic River administrating agencies, along with the Forest Service, the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And today I'm going to go over a little bit of direction that's that are requirements under law, regulation, and agency policy, as well as some interagency guidelines and both interagency and agency specific clarification documents that help managers look at these proposals for fish barrier projects on wild and scenic rivers, on rivers that have been identified as eligible or suitable for future designation, and evaluate those proposals' consistency with wild and scenic river designation and requirements. So I'm, along with the interagency provisions, I'm going to go through, I will go through a few Forest Service specific provisions, but also wanted to note that there is additional information related to Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service direction in each of those agencies' policies. But for right now, I'm going to focus on agency specific wise only on the Forest Service components, but happy to defer to my colleagues in the other agencies for more specific questions on those other agencies' policies. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So Risa touched on it at the beginning, the overview. We've got several different provisions that come into play when we're talking about proposals for fish barriers. Risa already talked about what is Section 1B that really lays out the river values for the National Wild and Scenic River system. That free-flowing condition, water quality, outstandingly remarkable values that are present for each designation across what is now 13,467 miles in the National Wild and Scenic River system. So that's a core component of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. We also have Section 7A, Kestrel referenced Section 7 analyses. That's the part of the act that talks about that no federally assisted water resources project can have a direct and adverse effect on those river values for which a river was designated. And so that's a trigger for looking at proposed essentially in-stream construction activities on any designated wild and scenic river. Section 10A of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that really reemphasizes river values and the requirements for each designation in the system to be administered in a way that protects and enhances each of those river values, not only the free-flowing condition, but also water quality and specific outstandingly remarkable values. And then 16B of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, that's the definition of free-flowing. To paraphrase a bit, it's that definition in the Act focuses on free-flowing condition as existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, riprapping, straightening, or other modification in the waterway. So that's the law that we're working with specific to wild and scenic rivers. There are then Forest Service regulations at 36 CFR 297 that are specific to implementing those Section 7 requirements of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Defines what a water resource project is, that it involves construction activities that could have an effect on free-flowing characteristics, which has essentially been interpreted to mean any construction activity below the ordinary high water mark of a river. And also specifies that no license, permit, or other authorization from any federal agency can be issued for a water resource project without a determination from the river administering agency that that project will not have adverse effects on river values. Forest Service manual from there. So we've got the statute, then we've got regulations, and then we've got agency guidance. And for the Forest Service, that's in Forest Service Manual 2354.7, specific to processes for evaluating these types of projects, which run the gamut. This is not just specific to fish barriers, but again, any in-stream construction activities. And in that section of our manual, it really lays out that the requirements for water resource projects under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act are not an outright prohibition on any projects, but only those that have a direct and adverse effect, in particular on designated segments. And so that doesn't mean any effect, that means a direct and adverse effect. And then the question comes down to, well, what is a direct and adverse effect? There's further direction in that manual that actually references some congressional reports from the early 1990s that talk about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act permitting structural and non-structural techniques of fish restoration to be used as long as such activities do not have an adverse effect on the values for which such rivers are designated. So again, re-emphasizing that this is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. It's a case-by-case basis, but ultimately, restoration activities are allowed if they don't have that adverse impact on river values. So that's all for designated rivers. For eligible and suitable rivers, there's other direction that's applicable. These are rivers that are not yet designated, but have been identified to have either by Congress or agencies as candidates for future designation. For a specific category of study rivers, as we also call them, those that have been identified by Congress, there are actual requirements for similar Section 7 analyses for these types of projects. So that's a statutory requirement. But otherwise, most other rivers, those rivers identified by agencies for study through planning processes, land management and resource planning processes, it's just guidelines and agency policies that apply. But we do have some interagency guidelines that were developed back in the early 80s that provide some direction about the types of development and impoundments and diversions that may or may not be consistent with each of Wild and Scenic River's 3 types of classifications: wild, scenic, and recreational, which relate to the level of development in the area at the time of the classification. And then lastly, Forest Service handbook that you see listed there, that's focused on a couple different things. related to eligible and suitable rivers. One, interim management direction for rivers and that have been identified as eligible or suitable, emphasizing that that there still needs to be a process to analyze any water resources projects that are proposed on an eligible or suitable river, and to ensure that there are no adverse effects, or that their adverse effects are prevented to the extent of existing agency authority. The language in that handbook also envisions enhancement of fish and wildlife habitat. In particular, fisheries could be an outstandingly remarkable value for a given designated river or eligible and suitable river. And so those construction of structures to protect and enhance fish habitat is permissible under our handbook, as long as it harmonizes with the area's character and fully protects those river values. So you can see a little bit of a theme here, a little bit of redundancy built in. This is all around not a bright line prohibition, but consistency with protection and enhancement of river values. The last thing I'll note about eligible and suitable rivers in particular is that our agency guidelines say that if a project is proposed on an eligible river in particular, one that has been found to be free flowing or have one or more outstandingly remarkable values, a water resource project like a fish barrier, then that should trigger the completion of a suitability study, the next step in the study process, to ultimately look at, and one of the considerations for suitability is whether Wild and Scenic River designation is the best method for protecting the river corridor and its identified river values. And so that project proposal can trigger this suitability study to determine, whether to manage the river as continue to manage it as an eligible and suitable river going forward, or if and if the river is found suitable, then the proposed project must maintain the free flow and protect those outstanding remarkable values. But alternatively, the river managers could determine that the river is found not suitable, in part because of the fisheries related needs associated with the river, and for instance, the types of barriers that are needed to protect listed or other species, native species. So next slide. So a few things from all of that direction that I just went through that have been developed both by the Interagency Council as well as the Forest Service to further clarify what this all means, how this can be applied in practice. There's a couple of different Q&A documents that have been developed over the years for both designated rivers as well as those eligible and suitable rivers, looking at these types of projects and project designs related to fish barriers. And again, no bright line rules here, but some further clarification laying out that fish barrier project designs that are most likely to not adversely affect river values, including free flowing condition, are those that you see listed here. Projects that are really focused on mimicking the effects of naturally occurring events in a river system, whether it be large woody debris or boulder movement, step pools, that sort of thing. Enhancement also does not impede the natural processes, natural channel processes in the river channel, such as bank erosion or bar formation, channel migration, those sorts of things. Thirdly, those projects that incorporate specific design elements to protect identified outstandingly remarkable values. For example, if recreation is also identified as an outstandingly remarkable value, then are there design elements for fish passage barriers that would be tailored to avoid a direct and adverse effect to that outstandingly remarkable value? Or similarly, if scenery is an outstandingly remarkable value, what sort of measures are taken in the design to minimize impacts so that drops below the threshold of direct and adverse impacts. And then lastly, probably goes without saying, but protecting water quality during the construction period. That's obviously an emphasis. Water quality is one of the river values to be protected and enhanced for Wild and Scenic River, as well as eligible and suitable rivers. And so want to maintain that protection during the construction period, as well as no long-term impairment on water quality too. So with that, I'll pause and turn it over to Sam. Next.
Thanks, Steve. My name is Sam Swanson. McLaughlin Whitewater, the engineering firm that I work for, is a division of Merrick. We specialize in river restoration and recreation. And so I'm here to speak briefly about our approach to engineering problems like the ones that Steve and the other panelists have described. That approach begins when meeting with local stakeholders, as you might imagine, such as Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and federal regulators such as the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Council to define criteria early in the design process. Next, we analyze gauge data, which gives us design parameters for high and low flows, like you can see in this graphic. We'll use fish performance criteria such as swimming speed, swimming depth, and jump height to inform the targets of our hydraulic design. In the past, we've used these parameters to allow fish passage from the lowest performing swimmers, such as catfish, for example, in the South Platte River. In this arena, we would instead be focusing on the maximum performance of non-native species to inform our design. Next slide. Thanks, Becca. At the same time, we'd ensure our designs are low hazard for recreators like canoes, kayaks, or rafts. This is a picture of a drift boat on the Gunnison River. You can see a recreator, a surfer right there beside them. So obviously multiple users to think of. It's often our practice to utilize loose natural materials as much as possible. Subsurface structures can ensure bed stability during high flow events. Our designs also feature large boulders, deep pools, and shade covering to maintain or enhance existing aquatic habitat. Lastly, multidimensional modeling tests the performance of a design across the river's annual flow regime, allowing us to see eddies and velocity jets that may act to harbor or repel non-native species at a fish barrier structure. Next slide. So one project that exemplifies this approach to river engineering is the Heartland Diversion Project near Delta, Colorado. The hazardous dam structure, which you can see on the left side of the picture, was replaced with multiple river features designed to mimic the natural riverbed. And I think in this case, we were passing threatened and endangered fish while providing recreation for boaters. So this project is a good example of designing an in-river structure with many users and regulations in mind. So with that, I think we're opening up to Q&As unless, Reese, you've got anything else?
No, well, thank you everyone for all the information, and it's kind of like a scatter plot graph. There's a lot of points of perspective, and it's maybe for the rest of us to think of how we would integrate those or some kind of reconcile issues on a case-by-case basis, I guess. If folks have questions, I think should we just raise your hand? Might be. We haven't seen too much action in the chat. Either we've overwhelmed you or impressed you with all the great information. If there aren't many questions, which it looks like it is, you could just raise your hand, unmute, and go ahead and ask a question. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Hey everyone, thanks for this panel. It's very timely with a number of wild and scenic designations and so forth in the Southwest. I'm really curious if the panelists would like to discuss a little more about. I think there's still a perception amongst agency folks and others that a river should, except in very rare cases like Fossil Creek, where there's an existing structure that can be enhanced, whether natural or pre-existing man-made. I think there's still a perception amongst river managers that either it's wild and scenic eligible or suitable or designated, or it can have a fish barrier. The easiest thing is to have one or the other. And I'm wondering if the panelists can talk about that a little bit. And in particular, you know, as we're working with agencies on rivers that are wild and scenic eligible, might be going through a suitability determination and might be up for designation in the near future. If there's any sort of reassurance we can give managers that say a native fish conservation barrier could be compatible. And I'm also curious about some of the other design elements. Maybe this is part two. We saw a lot of kind of pool drop designs, but then there were kind of flow barrier designs in there too. And maybe that's part two question for the engineering minds here, like Sam, on what are the capabilities of flow or velocity barrier type designs that seem like they might be a little more compatible with the free flowing condition. Excellent, thanks.
You asked a lot of questions, Mike.
I'm sorry about that. It wasn't, they're not super well formed.
Well, that's okay. So, no, Steve and Brian and maybe Kestrel. It seems like Mike was going back to how are the acts compatible? How do we reconcile what seems to be incompatible? And I'm overly simplifying, but you want to clarify that, Mike, just so we're clear and you're getting responses to what you're asking.
I'd just love to hear the panelists' follow-up thoughts on this. Thanks.
So I'll start, and yeah, to me, Mike, it still comes down to that analysis, and and the analysis drives the outcome, right? And not any blanket statements. So, are there, there are maybe designs out there that haven't been tried yet, that beyond the Fossil Creek example, that would meet the criteria for a Section 7 determination for a Wild and Scenic River, and really doesn't have an effect on the free-flowing condition or the other river values in a way that rises the level of being directed and adverse. I'm not a fisheries biologist, so or a hydrologist, so it's not my expertise to say what is or is not a design that will meet the objectives for species protection and viability, as well as a free-flowing condition. But I think certainly the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act looks towards protecting these and enhancing river values, including fisheries. And so it's a management complexity that doesn't lend itself to a one-size-fits-all approach, but a case-by-case basis that hopefully also leads to innovation and thinking about management of these river systems going forward.
Anybody else want to weigh in before we go to Michael?
I think I would just, sort of echo that. Well, I would speak to that last part that Steve brought up, kind of this idea that, and well, let me back up. I'm going to be honest, I'm not familiar with the language and the ins and outs of the Wild and Scenic Act to every letter of the detail, but to Steve's last point there about, part of that Wild and Scenic designation being the values of the river. And I think from my standpoint, our standpoint, that, fish very much fall underneath that category, protecting, reinstating the aboriginal species, whether it be fish, amphibians, other species that could be adversely affected by the introduction of non-native fishes, is all pursuant to the idea of a wild river and the values of the river.
And I might just add and emphasize just how much it varies on a case-by-case basis. And I do think that there are or have been recently scenarios where river managers have seen opportunities to have both a fish barrier or barriers while being on a wild and scenic river. And I think one of those examples is the Cache-la-Poudre River, and one that we're actively involved in. And the designs for that fish barrier have not been really even like formally started. But we're going to be involved as a advocacy organization to make sure that that those designs are hopefully compatible with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And in the best case scenario, maybe we can find an existing waterfall that doesn't require in-stream modification. But I do think and hope that, one of the purposes of this conversation is to maybe, get a little bit more clarity for river managing, for river managers and agencies, as you've suggested, Mike.
I can touch on the engineering piece if you'd like. So there's three types of barriers, right? There's vertical drop, which you mentioned. We've seen lots of examples of already. There's water depth. So if the water's real shallow, it's hard for fish to swim with them. And then it's velocity, related to swimming speeds. If it is determined that an engineered structure is necessary in a river, it's often hard to make large drops safe for downriver navigation at really high flows. So kind of the interesting part here for me is like you're trying to create a fish barrier, but also allow recreation. And so those two things are kind of fun to try to match up. Water depth is often a barrier in culverts. That's when I think about it the most, but also at high flows, it can be hard to maintain these shallow water depths. So then the third is water velocity, which you mentioned, that has been seen to act as a barrier in some of the river waves that we've designed in McLaughlin Whitewater. So there could totally be some potential use there as non-native fish movement barriers. But I think one of the most important things, as we've all mentioned already, is mimicking the structures that occur naturally in the river of interest.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, Michael, you've been very patient. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. Could maybe Sam or someone else point me in the direction of some case studies where these velocity or shallow water barriers have been successful? Not to come across as negative, but I'm really struggling to see these being 100% effective in hardly any cases. And I could very well be wrong, but I'd love to see some case studies for this.
I might have to go back to you, Michael. I can't think of any off the top of my head, and I think that's why it's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Hey, Matt Fairchild, welcome.
Hi, Risa.
Hey.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that last question from Michael. I think it is troublesome because, aquatic organisms live in the full amount of water that's around there, and at a site throughout the entire hydro period, throughout the entire year. So what may at some certain static flows of high flows, for example, be a barrier, at low flows it may not be. But back to my question, I guess my question is kind of for all the panelists, what are some of the examples of proposals? And what I'm thinking here in terms of proposals are actual water resource projects, actual modifications, work within a channel that have, and then also some examples of projects that have not been determined to affect the free flow of a river. So again, question is examples of proposals that have been determined that don't affect the free flow, and those that have been determined that do. And if there's not particular examples that come to mind, where we might find something like that. Thanks.
So in general, Matt, we've got some examples on rivers.gov, which is the interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council's website for Wild and Scenic Rivers. So there are a few, general examples of different types of water resource projects, including, bridges, bank stabilization, habitat restoration, with projects like large woody debris placement. But those themes that I pointed to earlier in the clarifying Q&As are the ones that sort of guide some of the outcomes to those Section 7 determinations. So if you're mimicking natural processes versus using bank stabilization techniques heavily reliant on exposed riprap, those are likely going to lead to different outcomes or findings in a Section 7 determination for water resources projects generally.
And I could add, and I admit I haven't actually reviewed it in a while, but the the Section 7 results from the Fossil Creek barrier did find that it wasn't going to impede free flow. And so that is an example to look at. But then also, and as I did mention this in my presentation, but the proposed barriers on the Upper Verde, and I know Jason Williams from the Prescott National Forest is here. Don't want to put you on the spot, but that kind of their preliminary review of those barriers is that those barriers would affect free flow. And so that's kind of why it's triggered that next step analysis. And yeah, Matt, I'd be happy to follow up with some more kind of resources and photos and examples on that one in particular.
Hey, Matt, Terry. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I thought it was very encouraging to see a lot of consensus between the presenters about criteria and need for evaluation on fish barriers. I think the examples that Kestrel put out there on the Upper Verde and the Cachalaputer up on the Big South Fork would be very helpful to review in greater detail as case studies as things move forward. And I think all this is maybe getting at the need to develop some guidelines, formalize this maybe a little bit more. Perhaps it could be pitched to the interagency coordinating council to analyze this further and thinking of the Upper Verde and the Cachalaputer as some prime examples. There may be others as well, but I think this has been a good opportunity to learn more about this issue, and I appreciate everyone coming together on this subject.
Any other questions? Comments?
I do know that we had potential question for the audience queued up, which was just if anybody else has had experience with fish barriers on eligible or designated wild and scenic rivers. I mean, whether it's the ones that we've already mentioned, but in particular, other case studies that we haven't covered here, or just ones that you've heard about. Just very interested in hearing other stories where this has happened.
Well, I'd just like to briefly comment that the fish barriers on the Upper Verde were proposed by the Bureau of Reclamation, their process didn't remotely resemble the rational process that was outlined by Sam, and that's regrettable.
That's what you wish for when you're asking for engineers to rule the world, Gary, but
Joe, did you have an example to share?
oh yeah.
Yeah, I'll follow up from Kestrel's prompt, which I think was originally from Matt Fairchild. I can think of two examples in Arizona. One on Fish Creek, which is a tributary to the Black River, the main stem of the Black River, and then another one on Bear Wallow Creek, which is within a wilderness area. And in both cases, these are sizable fish barriers. The Bear Wallow fish barrier is about 200 feet wide, 6 foot tall concrete wall within a wilderness on an eligible wild and scenic river. And in both cases, the Forest Service did not find that that section of the river was unsuitable. Rather, they just downgraded the classification from wild to recreational. So I find it really, honestly, really troubling the variability, it seems, within the agency with these determinations, where you have the Bear Wallow Creek fish barrier in a wilderness area, which results in just a downgrading of classification, but no loss of eligibility. And then on the Upper Verde, where the presumed decision coming out of the Forest Service is a stripping of eligibility and finding these fish barrier sites non-suitable. So it does seem like that there is a range of interpretation within the agency that leaves me sort of baffled. Like, how do we get to the Bear Wallow decision in one case, but the Upper Verde decision in another case?
Real quick, guys, I want to just be respectful of everyone's time and go ahead and share a couple of upcoming events. Thank our presenters, and then panelists, if you all have time to stay on and others still have questions, I can stay on and we can kind of continue the conversation. But just real quick, want to thank our panelists so much for sharing all these different perspectives. Maybe you're leaving with more questions than answers, but it's a really complex topic. So thank you guys so much. We have a couple of events coming up. The A- Collaborative has a webinar on October 5th. It's called Inclusion and Equity in the Workplace. Where do we start? This is geared specifically towards river people. And it's really, if that's something that's important for you in your organization and you kind of just don't know where to start, this will be a really awesome webinar to attend. It's a free webinar. Angie, if you could drop the link to that in the chat, we'll email that out as well. And then our next river management roundtable is going to be the second week of October. Do I have the day? October 10th. And for that, we'll be celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month with a panel of Hispanic river managers. They're going to share some perspectives on the roles of rivers in Hispanic communities, some projects in cultural corridors, and we'll hopefully leave you with some strategies to better understand and welcome Hispanic populations to your rivers and teams. We did record. We're going to email that out to you along with contact info for the panelists if you want to follow up. And we will also post the video on our YouTube channel where you can find pretty much all of our past river management roundtables as well. So check that out. And also, we would greatly appreciate if you share your thoughts in a brief survey. That helps us to make these better and better. So thank you all so much. We look forward to seeing you next month. And if you all want to stay on, we are here for a few more minutes. I think Jared maybe has a question, so we can hear from you. But thank you all so much. If you have to run, we appreciate you.
My question's more in regards to the 2012 planning rule and upcoming forest plan revisions. considering that a fisheries can be an outstandingly remarkable value and the concept of climate refugia being important as a potential outstandingly remarkable value, particularly here on the headwaters of the Bridger Teton, how does the forest or any other agency evaluate proposals for fish barriers when considering those native fish and encroaching non-native fish against that native fish outstandingly remarkable value?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Jared. I'd say, there isn't, anything related to climate refugia in our existing policy, but it is obviously a ripe question, whether as a standalone outstandingly remarkable value or incorporating those considerations into other existing outstandingly remarkable value categories, like for fisheries and wildlife. It's I think a dynamic topic that I'm certainly interested in having more conversations about how to what approaches are worth testing out to really deal with some of these management implications. I think the barrier piece and the management of the species piece is a little bit different in most cases from the eligibility determinations, because the eligibility, you're looking at what's there right now. Oftentimes it's the suitability step that looks at how to manage those ORVs going forward, what is needed, and whether that's consistent or best served through a Wild and Scenic River designation or not. But with climate vulnerabilities and impacts, climate refugia certainly is an important topic that, like I said, I know it's something that the Forest Service in general is grappling with. There's not specific direction in the 2012 planning rule related to eligibility there, and so there is a lot of discretion within each unit and how they approach it. But from a National Wild and Scenic River program, it's certainly something that I'm interested in exploring further, and happy to have some follow-up conversations with you too.
And maybe I'll just add real quick, and Steve, definitely cut me off if I have this wrong, but my understanding too is that, that all of the ORVs, whether that's, say fisheries and recreation and scenery, should all be managed equally. And so there shouldn't be, necessarily a prioritization of certain values over other values. And so I think, again, it comes back to like the balancing approach of how can we maintain or enhance, every ORV that's present on the river, including fisheries, but also the other ones as well.
Yep, that's correct, Kestrel. Thanks.
Nina, do you have a question?
The thing that I'm seeing with many of these endangered fishes.
Nina, you're really, really quiet. I think maybe we can hear you, but
Can you hear me now better? No.
Barely, not very well.
Oh, I know what I did. I turned the volumes down. If you want to take someone else, I'm going to change my audio settings.
We hear you a little bit, Nina.
How about that now?
Oh, that's good.
Okay, yeah, I just shifted them again. Okay, yeah. Because one of the reasons why people are interested in putting these barriers up for these fishes is that there are invasive species downstream, and the load on some of these wild and scenic rivers with invasive species often is not taken into account when we're doing these assessments of what the ORVs are, and when we're trying to figure out any of the different parts to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. We don't often think about how we're going to manage for invasive species as part of that process. because they're not really identified in the wild and scenic rivers as a category to deal with, right? And so we think traditionally about, whitewater values or native fishes or the scenic values or the geology or whatever it is we're after, but we tend to ignore the issues with tamarisk in the Southwest or Russian olive or all these brown trout and other rainbow trout out in places where they never were supposed to be. I happen to be in California and they're native here. So, but the fact of the matter is what's forcing people to put these barriers in are the non-native species that are down below. And part of what's missing from this conversation then is who's managing those invasive species that these federal agencies and other agencies that are managing the land feel the need to put these barriers in, because there's no coordination, if you will, at more of a landscape level of the invasive species so that you can prevent that mixing of the genomes. And there are just many other methods that we can employ as fisheries biologists if we have the will of the people in those areas to do that management. And I think that what you're not hearing from the fisheries folks is that their backs are up against the wall on trying to protect the native genome for these species. And then you're just throwing one more barrier in their face that they can't use to protect these species in these headwater areas. And maybe I'm being a bit nasty about this, but I mean, I fully support recreational opportunities. I really do. But these fish are not just fish, they're endangered fish. And they need to be protected somehow.
Thanks, Nina. Well, you described the conundrum, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just about, also it's, hold on, it's not just about recreation. Really, free-flowing river isn't just for people to kayak on. It's for lots of critters and lots of other things that depend on the sediment flow, all sorts of things. It's not just.
And I do completely understand that.
Great, thank you for commenting.
But there are reasons why sometimes barriers don't work for the genetic loading either. So it really is a very, very complex issue, but I really think at the heart of the issue are the invasive species that are out there on the landscape.
Anyone want to respond to that? We can just, Brian, furrowed brow, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, Nina, I agree that invasive species are really what's sort of precipitating at least part of this conversation, right? If we had a magic wand, then we wouldn't need fish barriers because we would magically remove the non-native fishes and invasive species from the landscape. And unfortunately, that's not, I've yet to see the magic wand. So we come to these other tools and these other tough decisions. And one thing and so I don't know if you were on for the beginning of the call, and if I didn't do a good job of speaking to that, then I apologize. One thing that occurred to me is that when it comes to invasive species is that the cost of prevention is estimated to be much lower than the cost of eradication and controlling it once they've sort of spread. I've seen some figures that show, I'm not going to say an exponential curve, but it's certainly not a linear thing. And so I think that's yet another reason that fish barriers and prevention of future invasion is on the table as a conservation tool. So thanks for your comment.
Michael, maybe one more from Mike and then Michael.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
In full disclosure, this is kind of a loaded question, but I'm very curious to get everyone's take on it. In my mind, the protection of native biodiversity kind of trumps everything else. And if it is the case, the designation prevents us from doing that. Is it the right thing to do?
Sorry, Michael, can you repeat the question?
I'll say what I think I heard. He said, is designation the right thing to do? Oh, go ahead. You're back.
Yeah, I apologize. My battery died on my computer and I always get mixed up operating this on the phone. So my question was, in my mind, the protection and conservation of native biodiversity trumps everything else we're talking about. And if designation were to prevent that, are we doing the right thing by pushing for it?
Now you're talking about designation with fisheries being an ORV specifically? Or designation because a free-flowing river applies to every Wild and Scenic River? Or maybe both?
Yeah, I think the question was a little bit more general. You know, if wild and scenic designation, successful wild and scenic designation, were to prevent us from conserving native biodiversity on the river, is it the right thing to do? But again, it's a loaded question. It's a philosophical question, but I'm curious as to folks' thoughts.
It's kind of important question though. It's like the elephant in the room, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that's like, you know, what we're all talking about. But I don't think it's black and white by any means. I do still believe that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is one of our, if not the most robust tool to help us protect rivers in perpetuity. I do believe that there's ways for it to not make it impossible, but it might make it a little bit harder to, you know, do fish barrier projects. And I think there's, you know, cost and benefit to that. But I do believe there are, you know, some approaches and some designs that can be compatible. And if that, you know, does take more time and more stakeholder input and more money, then that might be worth it to come up with an appropriate design that can both meet the standards of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and also achieve the goals of restoring native fish.
Matt?
Yeah, and just to echo what Kestrel said, I think no one here is going to deny the importance of considering those native species and their needs and protecting the biodiversity. That's pretty much, you know, what guides us and strives us to be here in the first place and have the, you know, recreational experiences in these places. But as Kestrel said, what's important is to ensure that we have an appropriate type of intervention if that is needed. And I think that's all the concern really is. And despite you know, some of the regulations and the process that is already in place, and what we've seen today, it sounds like fairly good criteria from different aspects here. But you know, what I think our concern is being able to see consistent decision making across the board, being able to have guidelines in place that people can ensure that really all of these considerations are being being taken under consideration to ensure that we have the best possible intervention if it is needed. the right place and done in the right way. And I think that kind of sums up kind of, you know, the consensus of what we're trying to push for. And I would hope that the interagency coordinating council would be able to you know, facilitate further discussion and dialogue on this subject in a more formal way with a white paper or something like that. It probably deserves that type of attention. And I would hope that that RMS and others might contribute to moving this discussion forward and having future forums and involving other actors as well to contribute to this discussion. But I think only by really looking at case studies, since every river is very unique and every situation is very unique, I think it would only benefit us to be able to look at a number of different situations and understand the issues more. And the more we talk about these and discuss these things, I think it'll become more apparent about the considerations that are needed as things move forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I think we probably should wrap, you guys. Thanks for all the questions, and thanks again if you answered the survey. And there are opportunities to do case studies. I see a scorecard to get categories of projects into like bins, and then, you know, discuss the different bins so that there can be a conversation between someone in Maine and someone in Arizona. Otherwise, projects are happening regionally with criteria decisions maybe not being shared broadly between agencies or states and local jurisdictions in the future as things go forward. Sorry, I'm extrapolating, but thank you everyone for joining us. Beck, anything else? Have I forgotten anything? Do we wrap up?
I don't think so.
Thanks so much, everyone, for sticking around. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.